Hello, everyone. This is Josh Sawyer. Thank you for attending virtually my DStars talk, and let's just dive right into it. So the talk I'm giving today is called Armor Clash, Mistrials and Mishaps on the Road to Better Armor Systems. So what in the world is this talk actually about? I'm going to be talking about how armor works and doesn't work in games. Mostly role-playing games or games with vertical progression in armor. That is, armor gets better and protects you more or does more for you. I'm going to be observing strengths and pitfalls in different systems as I see them. This is a less conclusive talk than it is speculative. A lot of times I give talks and I have a very clear idea of an answer to a problem. And there are a number of problems here, and I think I've solved maybe some of them, but as evidence will show, I have not really done a fantastic job at definitively figuring out how to do this. I'm also going to admit that this is more opinion-based and feelsy than it is hard and fast. I have a lot of biases about what makes a good armor system. I found in talking with people that a lot of people don't agree with me. I'll try to be clear about when I understand that what I'm saying is just a bias and not necessarily an inherent strength or weakness of systems in general. If you don't know who I am, here's a little overview. My name is Josh Sawyer. I am the studio design director at Obsidian. I started in the industry in 1999 at Black Isle Studios. Let me start using my keyboard so I can get rid of that cursor. Oh, there we go. Where I worked on Icewind Dale 1, that was the first game that I worked on. I was the lead designer on Icewind Dale 2. Then at Obsidian Entertainment, I was the co-lead designer. I finished Neverwinter Nights 2. Ferret Bodwin did the first part of the game, or rather, the first part of development. And then I was the director on Fallout New Vegas, also the lead designer and system designer on that project, and the lead designer and director on Pillars of Eternity, and the director on Pillars of Eternity 2. And I did the vast majority of the system design on the first game, and I did a decent amount of system design on the second game as well. So, as you might be able to tell, I focus a lot on system design, also narrative design, but today I'm just going to be talking about system design. So, what are the goals of armor systems? You could argue that they do differ from game to game, but there are a lot of common elements that I think most games tend to sort of cleave to. They mitigate damage. Maybe that seems obvious, but armor usually it makes you take less damage in some way or other. Through some mathematical formulae, you will take less damage by wearing armor. Most armor systems that have a variety of armor, we're trying to create a range of statistical trade-offs. If we have 12 different types of armor in the game, or 30 different types of armor in the game, we're going to spec that armor to give you different trade-offs in statistics. Maybe you are better protected, but you move slower. Maybe you are better protected, but your action speed recovers more slowly. Whatever those statistical trade-offs are, we create those to cover a wide range of gear. The system has to allow room for vertical progression. This is especially true in role-playing games where players, generally speaking, expect numbers to go up. Your character gets better, enemies get harder, but your numbers go up so that you can defeat them, and when you fight old enemies, you are able to steamroll them much more easily. So it has to allow room for vertical progression. It has to allow for a range of varied aesthetic styles. This is very important and something that I'm going to deal with right now to kind of encapsulate why we need all this variety underneath the aesthetic styles. So to use a very recent example, and unfortunately I'm cutting off the top of the cool armor over on the right, but Elden Ring has a really wide variety of aesthetic styles. The suits of armor, which actually you can get in different pieces, they look very distinctive and very cool, and they fulfill different types of player fantasies, from something like a scholar on the far left to a sort of more standard soldier, to very esoteric, the guy in the middle, I think that's a fire priest, samurai, or a very heavily armored knight. And the thing is, these styles, they correspond to a type of player fantasy. And in role-playing games, often what we're trying to do is we're trying to marry the aesthetic style and the fantasy to something statistical. So you might guess correctly, I think, that the armor on the far right protects better and is heavier than the armor on the left. That seems very basic and very simple, but in practice, it can be kind of hard to make all these types of armor feel like they're distinct in play, still valuable, and maintain that aesthetic identity. These are examples from Fallout New Vegas. You have the armored Vault 13 jumpsuit on the left, metal armor in the middle, and that's actually either the NCR power armor or the special Lonesome Road. I can't remember the name of that armor actually off the top of my head. But these are different sort of vibes. They're all vaguely or specifically wasteland, but the type of character you're embodying from light to quite heavy is very different. And then you have something like Cyberpunk 2077 that leans a little less heavily on heavy armor and more heavily on style. And in this, because the factions are so prominent, these aesthetic styles really need to represent the fantasy of being a rocker boy or a corpo or a nomad or a solo or whatever it is that you're trying to play. They're still part of the attire system and the armor system, and there are stats behind them, but the aesthetic is sort of cleaving to a certain character concept. So here's the big challenge. How can we make an armor system where we have all these different types of aesthetics and the different types are valuable in distinct ways that scale well throughout the game? One could argue that most games kind of do this well, but I, as always, am not interested in things that do things kind of well. I strive to find the best way to do things that I can, and often fail very badly in the process of trying to do that. So I'm going to go through a lot of the things that I've observed and tried to work with, so you can kind of learn from my mistakes, hopefully. So going back to the armor system goals: mitigate damage, create a range of statistical trade-offs, and allow room for vertical progression. These are the things that I'm going to be talking about. We sort of take for granted, to a certain extent, that we're allowing for a range of varied aesthetic styles. All these other goals are sort of underneath. We're going to have 20 types of armor. We're going to have 20 types of attire, if in this case this is Bloodborne, so it's less about armor and more about attire. But we want to create this room for character growth and distinction underneath the aesthetic itself. So let's talk about the good old days. Dungeons & Dragons armor class and the abstraction of just not being hit. This is the simplest way to do it, or one could say it's the simplest way to do it. So when I'm talking about Dungeons & Dragons, in this case I'm talking about basic, expert, that era, and also first, second edition advanced Dungeons & Dragons. In general, in these systems, heavier armor gave you a better armor class, and that was a numerical rating that you rolled against. Unintuitively, perhaps, better armor made your armor class go down, which was good. But anyway, what it meant is better armor meant harder to hit. You mitigated through avoidance. If you got hit, you took whatever the damage was. If you were missed, you took no damage. Heavier armor was more or less just better. So the aesthetic consideration didn't really come into it because it didn't really matter. If a rogue, or rather a thief in old editions, if a thief could wear plate armor and without penalties, they'd just wear it, but they couldn't because the class wouldn't allow it. So heavier armor was just kind of better. If you were a class, like a fighter, that could wear armor, then you just did because it was better. Magic users could not. So when you look at the aspirational image on the cover here, you can see the armored warrior with a shield and a spear and some sort of heavier armor, and then you can see the magic user or wizard on the right, and she's just wearing a robe. And that's just how those characters were. So armor was just good, and if you could wear heavier armor, you generally did. That did change in later editions, but it's worth stating where that started. So something that some games move towards, and some games still use either statistically or through more tactile gameplay, is the idea of mitigation versus avoidance. World of Warcraft has a lot of this through a variety of mechanics. So this is the shift from armor equals harder to hit versus heavier armor means you're easier to hit, or perhaps lighter armor means harder to hit, but you are harder to damage. So heavier armor Doesn't make you any harder to hit, but you will be harder to damage. So this is damage reduction versus dodge, all or nothing. If you get hit, the armor reduces it, or you don't get hit at all and you take nothing. So WoW has dodge and other mechanics. I'm simplifying versus armor. Souls games, Elden Ring has the idea of the heavy tank fat rolling versus the mobile character. Usually, and again, I'm generalizing here, it winds up feeling not particularly compelling because it's not distinct, so it's not taking damage in one of two different ways. I'd say that it's not distinct more in a game like World of Warcraft than it is in a game like Elden Ring, where your playstyle really does change based on load, for example. A second way it can feel not compelling is it's a wash. If both ways are more or less equally effective, meaning when you add it all up, the heavier armored character will take about as much damage as the character who just avoids most attacks, then it doesn't really seem like it's that distinct from each other. Another way it can fail is if it's imbalanced. In some cases, you have dodge systems where dodging is just purely better, or damage reduction is just purely better. So if you want to play the way that fits your style, but it's significantly worse, it doesn't feel good because you're essentially both trying to do the same thing, which is just not take as much damage over the course of combat. And the last way it can fail or feel not compelling is that it's highly situational. So ways in which one is better, or there are edge cases. Dodge, or in WoW, because there are certain requirements of when dodge applies and when it doesn't. When it's situational, it doesn't mean that it's bad, but it does mean you have to have a really high level of system mastery to understand when you want to use one or another. Now, one could argue, well, what does it matter if they both work? Well, personally, I like it more when systems can be distinct in how they feel, and where the aesthetic kind of lends itself more to a different play style. And the Souls games in Elden Ring lean more in that direction, but I think, and this will be, I think, very contentious, because I had a discussion with one of my friends, Nathaniel, who's a very good system designer, and he argued that armor was pretty valuable, or could be pretty valuable in certain types of gameplay in Elden Ring, but I'll kind of go into that a little bit right now. So the Souls or Elden Ring approach is you have a load, and once it gets to a heavy load, you are in the slow state, which is colloquially referred to as fat rolling, or rather, when you roll and you're in the slow state because you have a heavy load, you are fat rolling. So this is based on a load. It's a statistic that goes up, not by armor type, but heavier armor does weigh more. So if you wear heavier armor and you don't have the stats, which I think it's endurance, to wear it, eventually you'll go into a heavy load category, and you will, when you try to roll, it's very clumsy. So heavier armor also is not that good, usually, and again, this is debatable. The result, though, is that I'm not going to say, maybe you overstated this, avoid heavy load at all costs, usually by wearing lighter armor. So heavy armor itself you can wear, you just have to stay under the heavy load. And really, poise is kind of more important anyway. So there's a statistic called poise, which also can come from armor, and that is how much you can resist being knocked out of your stance, which is really bad because it makes you vulnerable to attacks. So poise is usually the more important thing than the raw damage mitigation, which is debatably useful. So I want to show an example of this in play. So the main character here is fast rolling. He is not fat rolling. The character he is attacking is fat rolling and cannot get away. So how good of a job, how important is the damage mitigation on that if you can't get out of the way of the attacks? Now, one could argue that a good enough player could get out of the way, but this video is, I think it's called Why You Should Not Fat Roll in Elden Ring. It just makes you a lot more vulnerable, especially if you're a melee character. It makes you a lot more vulnerable to attack. Now, that character was a caster, but they got into melee and was very vulnerable. So again, I'm not saying you can't play around it, but it's a hard kind of decision to make to go voluntarily into a heavy load. But then again, ultimately, the best tactic in Elden Ring, like most Souls games, is just not to get hit. just that easy. All right, I think you pretty much get the idea. If you haven't checked out their Twitter, please do. They have a ton of incredible gameplay videos like this. At a high enough level of play, it doesn't really matter what armor you're wearing because you're just so good. So if you don't take damage, damage mitigation doesn't matter. That is a very edge case. That's a high level of play. But ultimately, in Elden Ring and the Souls games, generally speaking, if you can just not get hit, then that is by far the better way to play. So let's talk about systems that kind of have a number soup underlying everything. A number soup is kind of an indirect system. So this uses the numbers that you're seeing as an abstraction of something else. So it doesn't represent like a literal modification to damage that's coming in. It's just a value. WoW, Skyrim, Elden Ring, they generally abstract total values into something else. Sometimes you can theory craft. It's like, so if the game isn't really showing it to you, you can reverse engineer and kind of figure out through testing what values correspond to what amount of damage reduction in what circumstances. The games often don't do it. Elden Ring, helpfully, will show you a damage negation value if you can find it. It's an alternate view. But you can see all of this math adds up to say you take this much less damage. I personally usually don't like these systems, although in some cases they're kind of required due to how equipment and gear slots and all that stuff works. The reason I don't like them is because it's harder for the player to understand the choices that they're making. I will say that displaying the total effect, like Elden Ring does, is much better than not displaying it at all and just letting the player try to figure out what that number really means. The reason ultimately I don't like it is because I feel like if you can't be meaningfully informed about what a number means, you can't make a meaningful decision choice. Great typing there. You can't make a meaningful decision about what armor you want to wear. So generally speaking, I prefer things where the number more or less correlates to something that's pretty easy to intuit. Indirect systems have their place. Lots of games use them, and lots of players are totally fine with them. This is my bias. Please come with me on my bias journey about direct systems that are a little more one-to-one in what they represent. So DT and DR, here's where we're going to start with this type of system. DT is damage threshold. That's a flat value that's subtracted directly from damage. If a DT is 8 and the damage is 20, 8 comes off, you're going to take 12 damage. So it's very straightforward. Every instance of damage, it works like that. Damage reduction. This is a percentage subtracted from damage. In Fallout 1 and 2, this occurs, and hopefully I'm not getting this wrong, I'm pretty sure it occurs after damage threshold. So if you have 8 DT and 20% DR, then you take 8 off the 20 and then 20% off of the remainder of that. So what are the effects of damage threshold? Small damage values, for example, I shoot an SMG and I shoot 10 bullets that do 10 points of damage at you. The small damage values get reduced a lot because that, if it's 8, let's say DT, 8 points coming off of 10, that takes it down to 20, or sorry, down to 2, which is a huge reduction overall. High damage values, for example, a sniper rifle or a rocket launcher or something, 100 points of damage, are less impacted. Again, if the DT is 8 and you get hit for 100 points of damage, well, you're still taking 92 points of damage from that. So it has an interesting effect on what types of weapons you use against what types of armor. Now, the effects of damage reduction are quite different. All damage values are equally affected because it's a percentage. So it doesn't matter whether 10 damage hit you or 100 damage hit you, 10% is coming off of that. Obviously, it's a different actual value, but the effect is proportional. It's always proportional. And DR is more effective because it's always going to take more damage off higher damage values. So again, 10% DR off of 10 points of damage is 1 point of damage. 10% DR off of 100 points of damage is 10 points of damage. So the effectiveness goes up as the damage values rise. Damage reduction in Fallout 3 worked a little bit differently. And I don't have any special insights into the reasons why they made these changes. I would assume it's to be more straightforward, but I'm completely speculating. So damage reduction was really the only form of damage mitigation. Maybe someone will tell me there's something hidden in there, but I'm pretty sure it's just damage reduction. So it's just a percentage reduction of damage coming in. Armor, medics, everything else granted DR. The growing percentage reduction, meaning as vertical progression continued, the percentages increased, but also the player's hit point totals increased, meant that damage had to bloat much higher to compensate, because a greater percentage is being taken off, your hit points are growing, and so damage values need to get that much higher to actually make a meaningful dent in the hit point total. And there's a problem with DR, there's a problem inherently in any percentage reduction system, is that you will run out of runway. If you're literally using the percentage values themselves and not abstracting it, for example, WoW will abstract their numbers into a percentage of reduction. But if you're actually saying this increases by 10%, 20%, whatever, there's only 100 points on 100%. So you probably don't want to make a character completely immune to damage, because that kind of means combat isn't super meaningful anymore. But if it gets up to 80 or 85, even that is really, really high. And Fallout 1 and 2 actually had some of these problems, and usually criticals were the only way around it, where a character had such high DR and DT that they needed to get an armor bypassing critical to to get killed, and usually very spectacularly. So that's the problem, though, with a pure percentage reduction system that doesn't have any tapering mechanism, is it just kind of, you run out and you can't go up anymore. So in Fallout New Vegas, I decided to be Mr. Clever and just do damage threshold. So initially I said there were a few instances of DR that got through, but damage threshold was the dominant form of damage mitigation. By and large, that's what almost everything had. Heavier armor slowed movement down, which honestly was maybe not that meaningful, because it's not like Elden Ring where you're doing like dodges and things like that. It's just literally like your run speed. And it weighed more, and the weighing more did matter a little bit because of how the inventory system worked, but maybe not that big of a deal. Now, there were a small number of meds and other bonuses that granted relatively small amounts of damage reduction throughout the game. Medics, I'm not going to remember all of them off the top of my head, but there were a small number that did that. Small number, and usually small in overall value. This worked pretty well to very well, arguably at lower levels, where the damage amounts were pretty normalized. At low levels, even a min-maxed character can only do so much damage over a non-min-maxed character. It did promote weapon switching in the symmetrical system. So symmetrical meaning that the enemies work the same way that the players do. So if you fight a raider and it's in a certain type of armor, it's working pretty much the same way as your armor. So if a rifle is good against you, it's probably going to be good against them. So using rifles against heavily armored enemies and SMGs against characters with no armor, pretty good way to go about things. And in theory, you really never run out of runway, because damage and DT can always keep going up. It's just subtractive. So you could have 58 DT and what attacks can do 100 points of damage, and then you can say you have 80 DT and attacks do 200 points of damage. Usually things don't get that high, but in theory you can just keep going up. It doesn't run out of runway. It worked less well when damage values get really high. You can't really protect against the big hits. So anti-material rifles, missiles, mini nukes, because the overall raw amount of damage is so high and it's just a subtractive thing with no percentage, it doesn't scale. So it doesn't matter if you have 8 points of if you have 8 points of DT or 50 points of DT if you get hit for 300 points of damage. Or maybe it does, but probably it doesn't. The overall amount of damage you're taking is really high. So then I did something else in Sawyer, which I think worked relatively well. Sawyer was my mod for Fallout New Vegas. I added base DR, damage reduction, to all armors. It already had, everything had DT, but DR was still there, so I decided to add it back and see how it worked. I kept the DR values relatively low. They had minimal vertical progression, so toward the end you could get up toward, like Remnant's armor had like 30 or 35, which maybe even that was a little too high. But in the late game, these heavier armors could really soak up those bigger hits through DR, so missiles, mini nukes, and everything were more survivable. If you get 30% damage off of something that does 300 damage, that's 90. right? 90 damage. Can I do math? It's 90 damage off that. That's not insignificant, so cool. And then you also have the DT on top of that. I didn't get enough widespread testing or like people really giving feedback specifically on that because Sawyer makes a lot of changes, but I think overall that it felt better. Why did I not stick with this? That's a good question. Now we're going to talk about damage reduction, which is really damage threshold, and I apologize for these terms, in Pillars of Eternity. I believe what happened was I was going to call it threshold, and people were confused, and I said, well, reduction in our other games means this, and it doesn't matter. I was convinced. It's my fault. People did convince me, but I allowed myself to be convinced to call it damage reduction, even though it really works like threshold in Pillars of Eternity. So it's largely similar to how it works in Fallout New Vegas, but it's more confusing, arguably, and worse. There are a lot more damage types. Fallout 3 simplified the range of damage types pretty extensively. I don't even actually know in the end if there was type damage in any meaningful sense. There may have been under the hood, but I don't think it was that significant. But Pillars of Eternity sure did. It had different types of physical damage, like from slashing and piercing and blunt. And then also it had burn, freeze, shock, corrode, and then raw. So that's 8, right? A lot, arguably too many to be interesting or meaningful, but it had them. Which is very traditional, like sort of D&D fantasy games do this a lot. Heavier armor would give you a longer recovery between attacks, or actions, really. I think overall this was a pretty good system. It took a long time to get to where it landed, but I think overall it worked relatively well. Players understood the trade-off more or less. They had a longer recovery time. Okay, I get it. That's the price of heavier armor. Overall, I think this was more or less a success, at least this part of it. The thing is, damage values tend to blow up more in Pillars of Eternity than they did in something like Fallout. Fallout's guns kind of stayed within a certain range, but we would have big damage attacks, a lot more big damage attacks in Pillars than, for example, Fallout. So high-level spells that take a long time to cast, or dragons breathing on you, or whatever that was, there were more instances of that, but DT still fundamentally worked the same way. So first of all, it didn't seem like people really made well-informed decisions about armor or attacks because of the sheer number of damage types and the sheer number of tools in their characters' tool sets. They had so many characters capable of doing so many things at once, it was pretty hard to make like a really smart tactical decision in the moment, at least from my observations of people playing. Another problem was that pulsing damage from things like damage over time effects like a poison or an aura, they use 25% the damage threshold value. Really not intuitive at all, because if you're trying to understand how much damage something is going to do through armor, asking the player, and we don't even explicitly ask them, we just kind of do it under the hood, it makes it really hard to understand what's happening. You have to theory craft it. So it winds up becoming that it's difficult to understand how impactful DT is going to be against any given attack. This is how it worked in practice. So, for example, you have an enemy who has 16 burn DT and 20 shock DT. The player can attack with a fireball that does 25 to 30 burn damage, or a crackling bolt that does 30 to 50 shock damage. So you might say the shock DT is higher, so I should use fireball. Except that the average damage is going to be lower if you do that, because 30 minus 16 is 14 burn, 40 minus 20 is 20 shock. So it's actually better to use the shock attack even though the shock armor is better. Now, this is a really minor example, but you have lots of abilities that you can use that have lots of different damage ranges. And the different defenses matter as well. So let's say, again, the same enemy has 25 corrode, but they have a 50 reflex, which is one of the defenses that you can attack, and a 30 fortitude. And you can cast Noxious Burst. And Noxious Burst does 30 to 42 corrode damage. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself. What's the right decision there? It's much easier to hit the fortitude, but the overall damage range is not that great. So again, you get into a position where it feels like maybe all of these are okay, but then you're not really making meaningful choices about what to do. Is that an awful thing? Well, I didn't think it was great, but maybe I was mistaken. So we'll get to that. And then another extreme example, the Master Below, which is a dragon that you fight in the game, has a breath attack that does 180 corrode damage. It far outstrips the ability of any armor to deal with it. So even the most heavily armored tank character really winds up taking a massive amount of damage, even compared to a wizard in almost nothing, and is moving much slower because of it. So it doesn't really, or not moving, but acting much slower because of it. So it doesn't really feel like it's worth the trade-off. So I got it in my mind that I needed to fix this system. And I have to admit that these were a lot of perceived problems that I saw that I didn't think were good, but players didn't really complain about, and I really should have probably paid more attention to what players were not saying than assuming there was something really wrong that I needed to fix. So these were my perceived problems with the system. One, players can't quickly make informed decisions about attack efficacy versus DT. That was the 3 spell examples I just gave. 2, high DT values still can't account for massive damage. For example, again, the Master Below. So my thinking, cool. Well, if I add a damage reduction, that does solve 2 because I can account for the massive damage, but it doesn't solve 1. And I got this idea in my head that it's really important for players to make these like very tactical decisions about what attacks to use based on DT. And I'm going to jump to the end here and basically say it probably was not that big of a deal. It probably didn't really matter that much. Or maybe there just shouldn't have been that many damage types. Or something else. But it's not so big of a deal that I should have done what I did, which is totally overhaul the system. There you go, completely different system. So I was inspired by one of my, oops, I cut off, that says quality, armor matching and quality. I was inspired by a game I played in my youth, one of my all-time favorite games. If you've seen my various playthroughs and talks and articles and things I've written about this, I love this game for the setting as well as a lot of systemic things. This is a historical fantasy role-playing game that came out in 1992. It used historical weapons and armor. So it had your warhammers, it had your maces, and it had plate armor and things like that. So, and it tried to be, it's pretty grounded style and aesthetic overall. So weapons and attacks can fail to penetrate, they can match, or they can fully penetrate armor based purely on type. Sort of. There's other stats like quality that kind of play into this and it makes it a little squirrely. But overall, that's the concept. So let's just assume that that's the way it worked because that was the inspiration. So for example, a longsword penetrates up to, and I always pronounce this wrong, cuirboli, which is it's the hardened leather armor. It matches scale, meaning it exactly matches the scale value, but it cannot penetrate brigandine or heavier armor. A military hammer, which is very good at penetrating armor, will penetrate all the way up to chainmail, and it matches plate armor, which is the highest armor in the game. So very, very, very effective at getting through armor. And there was a percentage reduction based on non-penetrating, matching, and penetrating, and it was very consistent. So if it didn't penetrate, did very little. If it matched, it did reasonably well, and if it penetrated, it did great. And every enemy's armor in the game is expressed in type terms. So even if you look at a dragon, it'll say plate or chain. It's not wearing that armor, but you understand it in the terms of what it can penetrate. So I thought, oh, this is such an interesting system because it doesn't matter how much damage you're doing with the attack. It's the penetration versus the armor. Getting a big brain. So this is penetration and armor rating in Deadfire, which was my solution to these perceived problems, So all attacks that do damage have a penetration score, and they do a damage value or multiple damage values, and they always have the penetration of whatever is more advantageous. All creatures have armor ratings for every damage type, and if a damage type isn't listed, it's assumed to be the base value. If the penetration of the attack is greater than or equal to 2 times the armor rating, that's called overpenetration, and you get a 30% damage bonus. If penetration is equal to armor rating, or above it, but below 2 times, meaning not overpenetrating, then it's penetrating, and it does normal, full damage. And if penetration is below armor rating, it does not penetrate. And for every point below, you lose 25% damage, down to a negative 75% maximum, which is still technically better than it was in the old game where you could go all the way down to 20% damage, or minus 80% damage total. So magic, attack modes, and other things can affect both your penetration and the enemy's armor rating, and vice versa. Wow, what a great system. What are the benefits of this incredible system, Josh? Well, there's a very fixed range of damage output. So I, as the designer, know that whatever attacks are coming out, 100% is going to be typical because that's a big middle range. It's everywhere from penetration all the way to overpen, which is a big numerical range usually. But that it can go up to 130 if you're min-maxing, and all the way down to 25 if you're way underpowered. So very predictable understanding of how much damage is coming out. For a designer, that's very helpful in tuning combat and combat encounters. Being a penetration deficit can feel very significant, 25% per point. So if you are 3 points under and you're at negative 75%, if you get 1 point of penetration, your damage goes up by 25%. Wow, that feels great. And once you get up to penetration, then you're at full damage, and that feels really awesome. And if you overpen, so if you're a min-maxer and you're super awesome, that's a big investment usually, or you're massively overleveled, then you do get a little cherry on top of 30% more damage, which is nothing to sneeze at. It's not game-breaking, but it's pretty nice. And penetration and armor values can scale infinitely. They're always relative values, so penetration can be 250 and armor rating can be 239. And obviously there's a big disparity there, but theoretically those things can keep going. Obviously there is the issue that those values will get out of sync because there's lots of things that can go into them, but conceptually they can just keep going forever. And small and huge damage values are affected equally. An attack can do 20 to 30 damage with a 10 penetration, which is not incredibly high, but relatively high, or 100 to 150 damage with a significantly lower penetration. They don't have anything to do with each other. So things like pulse damage from damage over time or auras, we don't have to do weird things like offsetting the damage threshold or anything. We can just say it has this penetration and this damage, and we're done. But it has a lot of drawbacks. So this is much, much less intuitive than either damage threshold or damage reduction. If players don't get it, they usually suffer a lot worse than if they don't understand DT. This is both from anecdotes and from watching people play. If they don't get it, they really struggle. They understand that they're not getting through and they're not really doing great damage, but they don't really understand why. Pumping damage is really easy to understand. So if you know that you're not getting through armor in Pillars of Eternity, easy, then just pump the damage and you'll eventually overcome it. Great, easily done. If the idea of pumping damage but also needing to pump penetration, it's more complicated and it's harder to get. If you don't fundamentally get the system, you're going to struggle. Many players were really turned off by the system. Those who liked it usually loved it, but those who didn't like it usually hated it along with the combat, and they really struggled. And to be honest, I still see and have still seen posts on forums, including Reddit, where people don't really get penetration and other players have to explain it to them exhaustively. It's not good. That's not what I want. I don't want the system to be so arcane that people can't get it. That defeats the point. Then they can't make any decision at all because they don't understand what they're doing. So after all of this, what are my thoughts for the future and armor systems? So again, effectiveness, distinctiveness in gameplay, and scalability across the game while maintaining all these different aesthetic styles, that's still the goal. And I think it's very hard to do. Every game I work on, I'm trying to figure out ways to approach this and make it intuitive to the player and effective and distinctive. It's a great challenge. It's very hard. I'm still struggling, but there we go. Next time, if I do get a chance to work on a game that has systems like this, I think I'm going to try to do something that's a more straightforward combination of damage threshold, straightforward damage threshold, and damage reduction, fixed strictly by armor type, but not scaling. So for example, heavy armor always takes off, even at first level versus the high-end heavy armor, it always reduces 30%. Medium armor always reduces 10%. Light always reduces 10%. Did I just? 30, 20, 10. You got it. So maybe I'll try something like that. I think that might do the things that I need to do, and I can just forget about the fact that players don't necessarily make the most tactically. That can be for ultimate players. That's fine. Don't underestimate the importance of clarity in an armor system. If it doesn't click, they're just not going to be able to play with it. So, I mean, I had this idea of I really want players to like engage with and use this, but if it gets too arcane and too abstract, Like even an abstract system like one in Skyrim where you just have a number that goes up, people at least can understand that a higher number is better than a lower one. In Deadfire, that's kind of how it works, but it's not really that clear because of everything I just listed. So if the system doesn't click, it's probably not worth it at all. So I want to say a big thank you to Julia for inviting me to do this talk. Again, it's very nice to be able to speak for DStars. Genuine thank you to all the players that have given feedback on every game I've ever made. I try to incorporate everyone's feedback into how I think about how I design games and how I make things for the future. And yes, sometimes I kind of put my head up my own butt and get like really obsessed with things that aren't necessarily real issues. So sometimes I just need to be able to step back and see what I'm doing instead of messing things up. If you want to reach me by email for just a personal or private question that you just want answered privately, that's totally fine. I'll try to answer it. My Tumblr I do use for answering questions that might have more broad applicability. So if you have a question that you think other people could benefit from, then please ask at my Tumblr. I also do have a very overly active Twitter. I would not venture to say that it's particularly educational. I mostly just post whatever comes into my mind, which is usually very stupid. So if you want to go, be warned, that's where it is. Thank you for the time. I really appreciate it. I hope you learned something from it, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the future. Thank you.